Greetings and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tao. You can also find me online at thesorcerersguild.com as well as on Facebook at the Sorcerers Guild. Today on Magical Theory, we are going to be talking about the law of repetition. We have talked about the law of repetition in the past, but this is a concept that very much bears repeating. In fact, that's part of the idea of the law of repetition, is that idea of getting a concept drilled into one's mind. Recently, I shared a meme, and the meme says, the law of repetition states, every time a concept is repeated, the power of its faith increases. Within this repetition is hidden the pattern by which the transfer of information generates the energy which then manifests on the material plane. Now, when I posted this, a lot of people seem to have taken this as a statement related to the idea of the secret, the law of affirmation, which is basically a bastardized version of the law of perceptions. Belief imparts reality. But when we take it to that extreme of belief creates reality, we have problems. But we've talked about that in previous videos. Today we are talking about repetition. And of course, this idea of the power of your faith increasing is of course connected to the idea of belief imparts reality. But there is much more behind this than just faith. And in fact, this is the reason that we can't so easily manipulate things through faith, is because of repetition. Okay, so let's start at the beginning of this idea. The law of repetition is how reality itself is formed. That's how all planes, not just the material plane, that's how all planes became and become manifest. Okay, so we have that very first transfer of information. The bang, the holy noise, the first thought, whatever you want to call it. It's going on all three places at once because time is separate. Even though one condenses into the other, they're still simultaneous. Because being in sync or being simultaneous is something that requires time. And when things that happen outside of time, you could say they're happening all at once, but at separate times at once. Yeah? It can happen here, it can happen in the future, the past, and the present simultaneously. Yeah, I know. Time is a little weird. That didn't make sense, but that's where we are. That's how it is that when you're outside of time, the past, present, and the future can happen simultaneously. And that's what's going on here. Okay, so at the very beginning, we have that first transfer of information. I like to think of that first thought as nothing is an impossibility. Poof. Blew your mind, yeah? Right? Well, not really. We all know nothing's an impossibility. We've talked about that a lot, but that was the first time a mind was blown, when there wasn't, because there was no mind before that. That was the first piece of the material plane, is nothing is an impossibility. Now, before we go any farther, I want to point out there are two things there. There's the positive version of that, nothing is impossible, as in you can do anything you want. But it is also, and more key for this moment, is that the existence of nothing is impossible by its very definition. If it was possible, it couldn't exist. If it does exist, then it's not possible. First conflict. The first paradox. Nothing is impossible. And from there, it began thinking about this. This transfer of information caused a response. And from there, this idea was repeated over and over until we have a concept. Every time a concept is repeated, the power of its faith increases. We really should be saying the power of its momentum increases. But none of these laws were originally written in English, obviously. These are concepts from the collective that actually function in every reality that I know of. At least the ones I'm able to interact with, yeah? There might be parts of the collective even that I'm simply unable to interact with because this is where my paradigms are. This is where my presets are. So this is the realities that I interact with, essentially, are the ones that have these rules. Maybe. Maybe that is all there is. That is about that. That's definitely a different video if we ever try to delve into that. Anyways, so for now, we have this first paradox bouncing off of itself, repeating itself. Nothing is an impossibility, considering all the different possibilities, all the different concepts and ideas of what that means, moving around until it gets out farther. But as this idea repeats, it condenses, and that transfer of information becomes energy, and that energy repeats, and still repeating that same concept over and over. Nothing is an impossibility. Nothing is an impossibility. And that creates that same on the astral. Yeah, that same first paradox from which everything else generates. And then, as that moves, we get that energy condensing, reacting to itself within the vacuum of being the only thing. So it's basically, it's a vacuum, but it's also, there's nowhere else for it to go. So it keeps interacting with itself and repeating and condensing down until we got that very first speck on the material plane. The result of which, bing! The holy noise. And the reaction from that holy noise reverberating and all these things repeating on the material plane began building up. And over time, we have realities themselves as this paradox is observed. Because that's the other part of this, yeah, is all this repetition. In order for it to be repetitive, someone has to be observing. Well, not someone, but it has to be observed. And that's where we get this first observer, the one that hears the noise. And that, again, is a different video. Today we're talking about the law of repetition. But that gives you some background as to what the law of repetition is. Okay, so what does all of that mean? Right? It means that there is a momentum behind things. And the reason we can't walk through a wall easily is because not only is there been repetition of there is a wall and the concept of wall within our own minds and our own psyches, there is also behind that all the different material that makes up that wall, the dirt, the dust, all of this. All these things on matter have infinite repetitions behind them, from the mental concept of the very atom to the energy, the transfer of information of that energy within the atom down to that part of the material plane, and it all builds up. There is a mass of condensed energy and thought that goes into every second of every moment. So yes, there is this idea that within the repetition is hidden the pattern by which the transfer of information generates the energy, which then manifests on the material plane. But that doesn't mean that we can just believe things into being. Yeah, that isn't what we're saying with this concept at all. This is in fact, this is part of the other half. This is what prevents belief from creating reality, because there is so much repetition and power condensed that we can only impart. We can only join into what already is from our current moment and positioning within the momentum. I have another video on positioning and momentum. I'm going to leave a link to that here. That's definitely within the same concept. So anyways, I think we spent enough time on the metaphysics behind this law. Let's go ahead and get to what it means for us as sorcerers. Okay, so I talk about intent, form, charge, release. And that's one of the types of spell models that we use. We also have the intent, form, charge, containment. When we are using containment, that is when we are most often working with the law of repetition, because we have an idea that we are feeding into a spell over and over again, trying to condense that information into energy, which will then hopefully manifest on the material plane. So this is like your candle magic, where you're lighting the candle, speaking the statement of intent, and putting the candle out on a daily basis. With each one of these, we are building up power within the candle, and we are building that up. Typically, there is a release, however, with these, like when the candle is finished, if the energy hasn't all the way if it hasn't already manifested. A lot of times with candle magic, things start manifesting immediately because you're generating a field. But each time you repeat it, it gets even stronger. And then eventually we still have the release because the whole candle burnt down. And if the spell hasn't affected by then, well, then now it's built up completely. So that's when the most powerful version of that spell is put forth, is when the candle is then finished. This is a good way to get around the lust for results, is by using repetition, because you have this obsession with the idea. Yeah, that's why that's what lust for results is that you can't quit thinking about what you need, what you want to happen with this spell. And the more you think about it, each time you think about it, you're pulling back on a spell that you've already cast, and it messes with the form aspect of the spell. So rather than do that, when we have lust for results, we use the repetition. And this is very powerful. This is how we build things up. But and we've talked a lot about that in the past, as well as with the cantrips, which is a more advanced version of the law of repetition. Utilizing the law of repetition, because we have one area that we're building up energy by repeating a concept over and over and over again. But then we have a catalyst, that moment where the spell is cast, that final act, which we don't do every time. We simply keep doing the first part, building it up, putting pressure behind it, so that when that moment is ready, we can then cast the spell and have all that build up in a much smaller period of time. And I have a video on that. That is also why hyper sigils, or even seals, really, there's not much difference between a hyper sigil and some of these ancient seals, except for that they're very old hyper sigils. And it's the same thing. We have this repetition going, repeating concepts over and over and over again. Now, there's more to this. Beyond that, I've actually talked a lot about this idea of the containing spells and using repetition to build things up. I think we get the concept. We've talked about this before, but the muscle memory, this is why that works. Part of it is because our body develops memory through repetition. That's why it's important when we're doing the energy work that we do these things often. We need to be developing muscle memory. But this also works with our mind itself. Yeah. This is a big part of how paradigm shifting works, is repetition. You simply keep repeating the concept to yourself, and the power of your faith increases. And this is something that can be, this rule, this law, can be considered in all aspects of life. There's a momentum created with things, and we can take advantage of this. That's a lot of the things that happen with synchronicity, in fact, is just these patterns getting stuck and being repeating. So if we watch for patterns in life, patterns repeat. We each have these patterns that affect our individual realities. Yeah. So what you want to do is watch for these patterns and learn to break the bad ones, because we can see these repetitions, how things repeat, how things cycle. And sometimes some of these are bad patterns. So once we've identified them, well, now we just find a different way to react, and we can change the pattern. But we can also identify good patterns this way. And some of these will seem silly, but watch. It's almost like finding the Fnord. It's there. You just have to be open enough to watch for these patterns, because they repeat in our lives. They repeat in history, right? Those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. That's what we're talking about here. The repetition, the patterns. Everything does it. It's all cycles, but it's not circles, okay? That's one thing that we need to understand. Increases, not stays the same. It's not a circle, it's a spiral. Going up or down, depending on how we react to things. And sometimes you want some spirals to go up, some spirals to go down. What do you want to add to your life? And by identifying patterns, we can figure out how to utilize those. Not only within our direct spellcraft, but with simply how we react to these things. Okay. So let's see. We've talked about how the law of repetitions helps create our reality. We've talked about how to use it in spellcraft, how to utilize it in our daily lives. The most important thing here is that muscle memory. That's why the glass hand, and especially your energy work, like the energy balls, things like that, we want to be doing these on a daily basis. Not because we need to find entertainment in them or anything like that, but because we want to create repetition. The more often we do it, the more our mind accepts the reality of it, the less the psychic sensor is going to fight with us, and the more that flow will be, and the more powerful that energy is going to become. And that's why ritual actually is important. And by ritual, I mean repeating the same thing from one time to the next. Repetition. Now, I'm very free-flowing myself, and I think a lot of you that watch my channel are. We tend to want to do things free-flowing, throw quick sigils and stuff. But we can take advantage of this too, this ritual, in small ways. Like for me, it's a snapping of my fingers. Much of my stuff is on that repetition of the snapping of my fingers while keeping certain things in mind. And it's through that repetition that when I snap my finger, these things are drawn into manifestation. And it's not like the very first time I snapped my finger, things worked. Right? It's repeating it. I've been doing it for a very long time. It's part of my ritual. It's part of the repetition that I use to create the muscle memory, or in this case, the mental memory of spellcraft, of successful spells. That's another part of this with the momentum and the repetition, is simply reusing certain parts of your spell components. Now I'm not talking about pulling the herbs back out from a spell or from an offering, but like you have a jar candle. Say you use a jar candle for one of your clients, and the jar candle, the first time you put their image on it and burnt it down. That's one of the things that I often do, is I'll put I'll actually make a printout and make a specific candle for the client that I'm working with. And then after, from that first spell, anytime I am doing spells of a similar nature for that client, as long as that first spell was successful, I will then use the momentum from that successful spell working with that client and use the glass from that jar candle in future spells we're working with that client. And that helps get us that repetition, that flow, that pattern of success. Yeah? Okay, so anyways, I'm sure you've noticed it's not Wednesday. It is Saturday when I put this out. And I have, well, it's been about a week or so since I put anything out. I was out in Las Vegas. I did intend to make some videos out there, but, well, things got out of hand. It was Vegas. A friend of mine got married. That's actually, there's no really great stories, or else I'd have a story to tell you perhaps tomorrow. Or, actually, I guess I probably won't be going live tomorrow either, because it's Father's Day. So I will be spending time with my family. But what we're going to do from now on, and I will try to stick to the schedule, no promises. Yeah, I am a little wild in the head. We're going to try and start doing recorded video on Saturday. I don't want to do the premiere thing. It didn't seem like that went well. So I'm just going to upload the video and put it out normal on Saturdays. And then on Sundays at 7, starting next week, I'm going to try to go live every Sunday at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, so that we all know when to get together. And we'll do an hour every Sunday for those of you that are able to meet with us. And it's probably not going to be walking. I'll probably have my computer in front of me. It just works out a lot better. So, we'll see you next week. I hope we're all enjoying the live stuff. I have been. And that's going to continue with, well, us chatting, and then I'll read a little bit from the fiction book that I just published. And we'll just see we'll see how they go. And any questions you have from the day before, it'd be perfect time to ask them the next day during the chat. Or in the comments, like usual, either way. Okay, so that's going to be it for this episode. Thank you once again for joining me. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, so that's it. Bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.